Thank you very much, Rashmi. It really is a pleasure to be here, and I want to thank you, Rashmi, and Inakshi Sobti for inviting me, and to Amreen Aga for generously agreeing to comment on this talk. So let me get right into it. Sayyid Amir Ali, or Sir Sayyid Amir Ali, as he no doubt would have liked to be known, was an important jurist in colonial India. He was the first Indian to become a Privy Councillor in London, and he wrote perhaps the most popular book on Islam in the 19th century, called The Spirit of Islam, at the very end of the 19th century. In that book, which was translated into many languages, somewhere in that book, he comments that Christianity and Islam, among all the religions of the world, are the only ones to own or possess their own names. The others, he pointed out, were defined by Christianity because they all have the term ism, ISM, at the end of them: Buddhism, Hinduism, Zoroastrianism, Taoism, etc. So he, by this little comment, what he meant to do was set aside Christianity and Islam as engaged in their own sort of intimate relationship, and all the other religions on the other side as somehow being derivative and defined by Christianity. Now, Islam stands in a curious position in this comment, as you can tell. On the one hand, it is intimate with Christianity, but on the other hand, in Amir Ali's view, it, as it were, takes the side of the other religions in disputing Christianity's claim to define them all. Now, what he meant by this division of religions is to suggest that Christianity and Islam own their own names insofar as they're capable of remaining religions theologically considered, whereas the other religions, which have ism at the end of their names, can only be seen externally in vaguely sociological terms, that the theological truth is not understood as being part of their essence. But I would like to argue here that Christianity and Islam, in fact, set the model for this kind of secularization of religion, if you will. Christianity, of course, because it arguably was the first religion, and religion, of course, is a 18th, 19th century category itself. It's the first religion that, in coming to self-recognition as religion, sets itself apart from other spheres of social, political, economic life, such as economic, political, etc. And Islam seems to repeat much the same thing by the latter half of the 19th century, because it's only in the latter half of the 19th century that Islam actually becomes a proper name. This is something Wilfred Cantwell Smith, the historian of religions, wrote about as early as the 1950s. Now, what do I mean by this? So if you look at the term Islam, it is, if I'm not mistaken, it's a kind of verbal noun. It's an adverbial construction. It refers to a relationship, the relationship possibly of the believer and God. So it could mean something like making peace with God. In whatever meaning you choose, Islam referred to a set of practices rather than being a proper name. It had not yet become, before the latter half of the 19th century, a name that could identify people. Rather, it referred to sets of relations and practices. So only from the latter half of the 19th century, as Wilfred Cantwell Smith notes, does Islam appear in a major way in the titles. He looks at, a huge, kind of huge lists of bibliographical citations of titles of books and risalas and treatises and all the rest, and notes that before the second half of the 19th century, Islam actually quite rarely appears as a name or a title in any of these publications, in Arabic or Persian or Turkish or Urdu or whatever. And it's only in the second half of the 19th century that Islam suddenly starts appearing. And his argument is that it has become a proper name. It has become the name for an identity. And when Islam becomes a proper name, it suddenly ceases to be a purely theological figure that names a set of relations or practices, but rather it becomes something which we can identify with, which Muslims identify with, and which can also, nevertheless, refer to practices that themselves are not particularly Islamic. So, for instance, you can have a title such as, I don't know, heresy in Islam. So if Islam were truly taken as a theological category, heresy, of course, would not be part of it. It couldn't fit in it. You can think of, wine drinking in Islam. Any number of such titles or potential possible titles become possible once the term has been de-theologized, as it were, and in that sense made into a kind of secular category. So, though Amir Ali doesn't seem to have acknowledged this, it looks like just as with the religions ending in ism, Islam too, and perhaps Christianity also, end up by the end of the 19th century in this curious place where it's not clear how much of a theological category that can be understood as being. Now, once this happens, religion as this kind of category, as a proper name of the kind I've been describing for Islam, can only reclaim or lay claim to the other spheres, the political in particular, which I will come back to, but the economic and many other spheres, from which it has been separated by, as it were, denying its own birth. What do I mean by this? So if religion has been invented, let's say, in modern times, in distinction, as distinct from the political, the social, or the economic, the only way in which religion can reclaim or lay claim to these other spheres is by denying its own birth, by, as it were, emphasizing its own secular credentials and claiming them much as modern secular ideologies lay claim to the totality of social relations. And this, I want to suggest, ends up being perhaps its chief contradiction, that the only way in which a religion once defined as a religion can claim things that are supposedly outside it is by destroying its own birth as a religion. Now, how does Islam emerge as a proper name that starts losing theological character very quickly? It does so, I want to suggest, because sometime in the 19th century, in context defined by colonialism, it starts being freed from its traditional authorities. So, whereas traditionally, let's say, you have debates and sometimes disputations between groups such as the ulama, sort of lawyers or juristical scholars of Islam, Sufis who are more interested in philosophical and mystical approaches to Islam, and other kinds of figures over the practices that they lay claim to, the law on the one hand, mystical attitudes and practices on the other, philosophical ones, etc. These old-fashioned debates and disputations suddenly lose meaning sometime during the 19th century, once Islam emerges as this new kind of proper name and people start arguing and laying claim to it as something quite distinct. Islam now names, it could be any number of things, but it no longer is any specific tradition of practice or of belief or of investigation or anything like that. And indeed, Islam has come to be freed from its traditional authorities, precisely because it has come to transcend these practices, such as the practice of thinking about law and sort of juridical authority, or philosophical and mystical or theological authority, etc. And in one sense, of course, Islam appears in this manner because of the consequences of colonial rule, under which traditional Muslim authorities, whether profane or, dare I say, secular authorities like kings and princes and emperors, have been divested of their authority. And partly as a consequence, theological, philosophical, juridical, etc., other authorities have also lost a great deal of their purchase and their relations with these profane or secular figures who had ruled Muslim societies. So Islam, in a way, achieves its proper name, or its status as a proper name, and emerges in this new way as a semi-theological or semi-secular category, largely under colonial rule, in a way that downplays the debates and disputes and claims of traditional authorities. And in this way, it also spreads under colonial rule. So in a way, one of the extraordinary phenomena of colonial rule is the huge expansion of religious proselytism and conversion, often among people who might have been notionally or nominally Muslim, or for that matter, Christian or Hindu or whatever, but who come to be made into proper Muslims, whatever that designation means, and different groups had different ideas of what it meant. Under colonial rule. So under colonial rule, you see a huge expansion of Islam itself as a proper name, with its ambiguously secular / theological character. And on the other hand, these different forms of Muslim identification and Muslim belonging, precisely, I would argue, because of the exit or the loss of power of pre-colonial rulership. And in a way, one of the things that happens is that just as Hinduism in this very period, when it is freed from kingship, comes to be defined by caste as its essence. This is an argument made by an old teacher of mine, Ron Inden at the University of Chicago, in a famous book called Imagining India. So just as it were, caste becomes centralized in a new way, not that it didn't exist before, as the very thing that defined Hinduism, once you got rid of kingship, once kingship is no longer an important political consideration under colonial rule, so too Islam comes to be defined in this period by law, by Sharia, as its essence among many Muslims. And in both cases, you have therefore the definition or redefinition of Hinduism and Islam as self-governing systems. They've been almost, how should I put it, sort of closed off. They no longer have organic relationships with princes and kings and emperors, and as it were, non-theological or profane or even secular forms of authority. And they come to be defined as almost as infernal machines, one defined by caste and the other by law. Both are singularly also not named after founding figures. So even though Amir Ali had put together Islam and Christianity, as opposed to all the other religions named after, whose name ends in ism, what I'm suggesting here is that Hinduism and Islam come to occupy this space, this new kind of pairing. Both almost alone, as contrasted with all the other religions, are not named after founding figures. And in this sense, of course, Christianity can be placed alongside Buddhism and Zoroastrianism, etc., as being named after a founding figure. And both are understood in colonial times as being sort of self-governing systems which don't require political authority. And you can see the colonial advantage of this, that you have these religions that don't require political authority, they run themselves, they have an essence which can be understood and manipulated. And it's law in one case and caste on the other. So even though it's fashionable to set monotheistic or Abrahamic religions on one side and polytheistic, etc., religions on the other, here I want to argue that actually Islam and Hinduism come together in quite interesting ways. Now, this new Islam, this Islam is a proper name that I've been describing, emerges in a way out of the refusal to inherit the political tradition of pre-colonial Muslim societies or Muslim-dominated societies. So the authorities who I described earlier, whether the ulama or Sufis, and I will come to the Islamists and indeed the Modernists, whom they are so frequently paired with in a bit, these figures who might have been constrained by kingship and by profane or secular authority in the past, which defined, if you will, courtly culture, painting, music, politics, etc. Once you get rid of that culture and get rid of those authorities, these figures who claim to speak in the name of Islam, as I have suggested, are now suddenly, they've been colonized, but they're suddenly free to propagate a new kind of Islam of the kind I've been describing. And so they do, and this accounts for the huge expansion of proselytism during this period, not only just with Islam, but with other religions as well. You see this happening with Hinduism, of course, with the Arya Samaj in this period, and of course, other groups as well. So you have a curious situation here. On the one hand, you have colonization, and either the extinction or the disempowerment of both profane and theological Muslim authorities. On the other hand, this very process of colonization allows for the vast and immense expansion of Islam, but in this new avatar that I have been describing. So this new form of Islam, in order to take advantage of its freedom, must refuse, repudiate, and reject the whole political tradition of Islam, or practically all of it, that had been that had defined the norms of Muslim societies, into practically the middle of the 19th century in many parts of the world. And this happens extraordinarily rapidly in a place like India, for example. Now, so you see how this happens. In order to claim to represent Islam, you have to get rid of the kings and the courts and the culture and the politics and the political language of this pre-colonial world. And this poses a specific problem. So when these new Muslim figures, these new Muslim entrepreneurs or these Muslim authorities want to universalize their vision of the world and reclaim politics or claim politics, they can't do so in traditional Islamic ways. After rejecting kingship and its language, what can they rely upon? They can only claim politics, I want to suggest, in European terms, ideologically, all right, and not in any other way. So this is another part of the contradiction that I mentioned earlier. Now let's go back to naming for a bit here. There are a plethora of names that in this period from the second half of the 19th century until today that are used to refer to Muslim movements and religious practices and beliefs. In the earlier bit of the colonial enterprise, for instance, Mohammedanism, you will recall, was an important such name, and one that seemed to have been largely accepted by Muslims, at least in English. So you have, the famous the Mohammedan Anglo-Oriental College, which becomes Aligarh Muslim University. The shift from Mohammedan to Muslim is quite instructive and interesting here. So Mohammedanism was of course not a Muslim usage, it was a European usage, and it made Islam, like Hinduism, Buddhism, Zoroastrianism, into one of those religions, which are named by ISM at the end of them. But you have, as a kind of a pushback by Muslims, and Mohammedanism is replaced by Muslim or Islam, as Amir Ali notes already by the end of the 19th century. But it's this new kind of Islam that I've been describing. So you have the shift from Mohammedanism to Islam, and Mohammedanism might have named a set of practices, for instance. Islam name becomes this proper name. You also have, at the end of the 19th century, the term pan-Islamism, in which you find the first appearance of the name Islamism, which is the subject of today's talk. But it's used quite differently. So pan-Islamism, of course, names a kind of irredentist ideology on the model of pan-Slavism, or pan-Hellenism is not the same sort of thing, because it tends to be about Greek independence, but it also has a pan-European presence, pan-Hellenism, but say pan-Slavism, pan-Turanism, pan-Islamism, right? So it belongs in that late 19th century world of pan movements, which are considered to be irredentist and ideological in a very modern sense. Clearly pan-Islamism, if you put together with pan-Turanism or pan-Slavism, cannot be considered a purely theological, if at all, a theological figure, right? So now these pan movements, of course, emerge at if you will, the tail end of, or the height of imperialism, which they mimic, and the Ottoman Empire not accidentally takes on pan-Islamic characteristics. So imperialism and pan-Islamism or pan-Slavism, in a way, belong to the same world of expansive and irredentist power. So you have Mohammedanism and Islam, that's one coupling of categories and a shift between them. You have pan-Islamism and imperialism, I want to suggest. And then you have the emergence of fundamentalism and Islamism, the third couple that I want to look at, which is where our contemporary word Islamism really comes from. So fundamentalism, of course, is a Protestant, more or less, term, and refers to those Protestant or evangelical groups, especially in the United States, that base themselves on a, as it were, literal or literalistic reading of Scripture. And it is a term that comes to define other kinds of apparently similar religious movements, particularly important from the late end of the 1970s through the 1980s and early 1990s. This is the glory era, if you will, the period of fundamentalism as a term, as a category. And because it emerges, as it were, from an American world, you can see how things have changed radically. We are no longer talking about a European-dominated imperial epistemological and political order from which these categories emerge and to which they refer. Here you have a quite different Cold War order in which it is America that is really the defining, and America that gets to be, or Christianity that gets to be the model for everyone else. And I well recall when I was a student at the University of Chicago, there was Martin Marty had a big fundamentalisms project, which was meant to look at the apparent rise at the same time in the 1980s of new religious movements, which include Hindu nationalism, which include what later comes to be called Islamism, Buddhist forms of militant forms of Buddhism, etc., in Sri Lanka, for instance. And they were all called fundamentalism. And of course, fundamentalism has the advantage of making them all comparable, despite or because of its Christian and American origins. So you can say that Hindu, Muslim, Buddhist, etc., forms of fundamentalism can somehow be compared, which is what the Fundamentalism project at the University of Chicago did. In the 1990s sometime, and certainly after 9/11, Islamism takes over completely and fundamentalism collapses almost entirely as a term, which is itself a quite interesting event, interesting thing to have happened. And I haven't seen any real discussion of why and how this shift occurred. And one of the things that is happening in this shift, of course, is that Islam is separated out from all the other religions. So far, I've been talking about Islam in, starting with Amir Ali, in a context of comparison and contrast, right? With Islamism, you move Islam out altogether. It's its own thing. It doesn't bear comparison with anyone else, and yet it takes its name from something by then already old-fashioned. The sort of great ideological movements of the 20th century. So capitalism, of course, is one, and communism is the other. These are the two big ones, and there are many smaller ones that pretend to or desire to be somehow reconstructed in the image of either capitalism or communism as truly global phenomena. Phenomena that have that kind of ambition and that kind of scope, and that vision of ideological systematicity that is especially characteristic of communism. An ideology that seeks to encompass everything, that seeks to understand everything, right? So what is happening in these shifts that I'm describing here from one name to another? You have a shift on the one hand between as to a theological set of categories to modern forms of religion as semi-secular terms. You have a shift from the imperial context, which defined pan-Islamism, for instance, to the Cold War context, for which Islamism comes to be, if you will, among the last of the Cold War ideologies, which had included forms of third world socialism, etc. Right? Via the evangelistic mediation of the term fundamentalism. Right? So all of this might seem a bit confusing, but I just wanted to lay out as briefly as possible the historical context from which the term Islamism emerges. And the two, of course, are, to repeat them, imperialism and the Cold War, the world of Cold War ideologies. Now, the emergence of Islam as a new term, as I've said, shifts the struggle over authority and Muslim practice from these debates and disputations over ideas and texts and all the rest to the ownership of a name, Islam. What is Islam? And who can be named as a Muslim in quite different ways than these arguments have happened before, because Islam has been redefined either as a rational system or in the Cold War fashion as an ideology. And indeed, even in the late 19th century, once you have ideologies emerge in their modern senses. Now, there are two groups that emerge to really colonize this field. And these are, first, the Modernists, as they are known, who emerge in the latter half of the 19th century, together alongside with the changing of the terminology itself, the emergence of Islam as this new category. And then later on in the early 20th century, the Islamists, people whom we now call Islamists, and who we used to call fundamentalists. The Modernists, of course, In India, everyone is aware of people like Syed Ahmad Khan, who was meant to be the earliest, one of the earliest, if not the earliest, modernist, and his project to modernize, as it were, Muslim society and to rationalize Islam in modern terms, to make it congruent with the laws of nature, etc. Right? The Islamists take on a great deal of the modernist baggage, if you will, including this idea of Islam as a new as a kind of system, which is also a rational system, which also needs to somehow be faithful to the laws of nature, this sort of Victorian idea, and which also needs to be modernized in some ways. But of course, they have a quite different understanding of the details of this project. But the modernists and the Islamists, I want to argue, as it were, belong together here. And the modernists come first and define what this new term Islam is to mean, and what a Muslim project should look like. Now, we tend to separate modernists and Islamists by thinking that the former are liberals and the latter are not, are illiberal in various ways. But more specifically, we tend to understand the latter, the Islamists, as somehow propagating something called political Islam, or making claims towards over politics that the modernists didn't make. This is not entirely correct, because if you look at important political projects such as Muslim nationalism in India and the founding of Pakistan, much of it is conducted by people who subscribe as modernists and who have modernist ideals and who have political ambitions. So in part, the political ambition is to gain sufficient freedom for Muslims to run their own societies so that these societies can be reformed and modernized, which they think that the colonial state disallows. That the colonial state is too wedded to traditional Muslim authorities, both aristocratic and religious, and therefore Islam and Muslim societies are kept backwards. And so that the desire to assume political control over Muslims, eventually in a country like Pakistan, is informed by the corresponding desire to transform those societies. And you can see that, they share this desire with all kinds of other people who are not defined as in religious terms. Nehru says much the same thing in his discovery of India. He's not referring to religion. He's referring to nationalism. But what he says is that the British rule in India depends upon the most conservative segments of Indian society, and that however nice or representative it might be, it can never really modernize India because of these conservative supporters that it relies upon. And therefore, what nationalism is meant to do, at least in part, by removing the British, is to truly modernize India. Because of course, the British claim is that they are modernizing India, and Nehru's argument is, no, you cannot modernize India, not only because India needs to be free in order to be modernized, but that British rule depends upon the most backward and conservative elements in Indian social life. So it's a similar argument that the modernists are making. So they do have a political project, and you can't separate their political project very cleanly from the Islamist one by saying one is political and the other isn't. Now, the other consideration here is that this term political Islam, which we use so blithely today, itself emerges out of a Christian history. No Muslim, pre-modern Muslim text that I know of, or authority that I know of, ever makes any claim about Islam being specifically political as opposed to any other religion. Or, that there is no, to my knowledge, there is no recognition that somehow Islam is understood as being more political than, say, Christianity or Judaism or any other religion, or that politics is somehow fundamentally a part of Islam. This is a very modern way of thinking. And its modernity comes out of the Reformation in Europe, when, of course, the issue of religious politics or political religion becomes important in Europe, in Western Europe itself. And as part of the debates and disputes between Protestants and Catholics in this period, Islam is held up as a kind of image of the other. So, Protestants can accuse Catholics of being actually no better than Muslims because they are too political, and Catholics can blame Protestants for being no better than Muslims for very similar reasons. So, if you will, the term or the idea of political Islam emerges out of Christian Europe through the wars of religion, and doesn't have a Muslim or Islamic history. But it is accepted by Muslims in the 19th century in large part. Now, nevertheless, for Islamists, to come to them, politics, though they may want to claim it, poses a problem. Now, I'd already suggested before that it poses a problem, at least in part, because it means to claim something like politics means to actually put into question the idea of religion itself, that Islam is founded to, in its modern incarnation, to name. But it poses another kind of problem, which is that insofar as Islam in colonial times has already been defined as a self-sustaining system at whose heart lies Sharia law, and there are no kings any longer, no princes, no royal culture, nothing. All of that has been dismissed as un-Islamic. Does politics have the potential to destroy the very essence of Islam, considered in legalistic terms? And this is the problem that the Islamists rehearse endlessly over and over again. You see a similar problem emerging in Hinduism, which, as you will recall, I suggested, had come in the same period to be defined by caste, or on occasion by the village, the panchayat, right? So whether it's law for Islam or caste or the village for Hinduism, these are understood as being proto-political forms of self-governance, right? Which, as I've argued, can only emerge as such once you have gotten rid of or disempowered kings and princes and the culture that they represent. So the big problem for Hindu nationalism is caste or the village, and the big problem for Islamism is the law, and how politics, modern politics, can or cannot fit with these, these essences of the religions. Now, just as Sayyid Ahmad Khan is considered the chief or the founding figure of modernism in India, but indeed not just in India, he's possibly the earliest one in the whole world, right? A Muslim modernist. So too we have Maududi, Abul Ala Maududi, the founder of the Jamaat-e-Islami, as arguably one of the earliest Islamist thinkers and political figures, not just in India, but in the world. And certainly one of the most important ones in the world, if not the most important one. Now, what's going on? Maududi is from Hyderabad, Deccan, and eventually he moves to Pakistan, and he founds the Jamaat-e-Islami in India, and he founds it in Pakistan as well. Now, there's something quite interesting, if I can shift to Maududi here as this founding figure of Islamism, that's going on, which has to do with this contradiction between the law and politics. Right? So the proponents, the self-described proponents, both of Islamism and of, to some degree, of Hindu nationalism, precisely because they hold fast to these would-be essences of their religions in caste and in the law, are not so trustful of the state. They might want to take it over, but they actually often want to roll it back. They want to take it over to roll it back. And the same is true of Maududi. So these figures are part of a set of movements in the, from the early to the mid 20th century that are vaguely, if not explicitly, anti-statist. And Gandhi himself is one of these figures in his own way. Gandhi, remember, calls himself a philosophical anarchist. He's interested in the self-governance of Indian society through precisely the village and caste, right? And he wants to capture the state, but to minimize it, to roll it back. Maududi, who was a great admirer of Gandhi's, in fact, he wrote an adulatory biography of Gandhi, which was promptly banned and destroyed by the colonial government. He wrote two biographies. It'll be interesting for you to know. One is of Gandhi, the other one is of Madan Mohan Malviya. Both explicitly and ostentatiously Hindu figures. So Maududi too, like Gandhi, from whom he takes a lot, actually, I think, is interested in the self-governance of Muslim societies through the law. So if for Gandhi it is caste and or the village suitably reformed, for Maududi it is the law equally suitably reformed. And the state therefore needs to be conquered, but only to be rolled back, because all of these figures in a way draw their ideas from, in part, from a kind of anarchist sensibility. And there's nothing strange about this, because you will recall, any of you who are familiar with Indian history, that in the period just before, during, and after the First World War, the great militant movements of India were all anarchist in character, with their assassinations and their, whether it's Ghadar movement or the sort of revolutionary terrorism and all the rest. It's only after the First World War that nationalism, in its status sense, is set in place in a big way, and in a way that happens in part because anarchism is destroyed as a political form by Bolshevism, by the Russian Revolution and the establishment of the Soviet Union in Russia. Though, of course, communism encapsulates at its very heart an anarchist sensibility, which, of course, is the idea of the withering away of the state. So Lenin has this idea that you take over the state and you have a dictatorship of the proletariat, and eventually what you're going to do is roll back the state and destroy the state, because you have to replace the government of men with the administration of things. And this indeed is what all of these figures like Gandhi and Maududi also in their own way believe in. And sometimes, as with Gandhi, they're explicit in their reference to Lenin, right? And Maududi, who also reads Lenin, is also informed by these ideas, not least because he organizes his Jamaat-e-Islami party on the model of the Bolshevik party, right? So these ideas, these figures, etc., are not, part of some ghetto, either Islamic or South Asian ghetto, which has its own logic and its own history. They are part of global history and a global set of ideas that are moving around the place. So what does Maududi, and I'm using him, of course, to describe Islamism, want? He wants to take over the state, to roll it back and make the law and therefore society into the form of self-governance that he thinks Muslim societies require. And he does so, he makes this argument in a very interesting way by repudiating and rejecting the European idea of sovereignty. Now, notice that nationalism is all about claiming or reclaiming sovereignty, right? Here you have a figure like Maududi who wants to reject and repudiate it. So why does he do this, and how does he do so? He does so by saying that the European idea of sovereignty, and he names Hobbes in particular, but also Jean Baudin, is theological, that it presumes a power and an authority so absolute that no human being can really hold it, that the sovereign is a theological figure. And of course, he's not incorrect in making that argument. And what he says is that it is precisely because no human assembly or personage, a president or a king or whatever, no human body of people, or men or women or a single individual can really instantiate sovereignty in their own persons. And precisely because they cannot, because there's a gap between sovereignty as an ideal and the reality of power and authority, between the gap that comes to exist, violence and despotism emerges or enters. And therefore, the important thing to do is to resign sovereignty and attribute it to God. Only God can be sovereign. And so human polities and human societies should not be characterized by sovereignty. They should be characterized precisely by what Lenin called an administration of things. And this becomes possible through caste, for the Hindu example, through caste, as I said, in India, and through the law, through Sharia for Islam. And Sharia operates very much like caste in this, in the Islamist imagination. How so? Because it's meant to be a self-sustaining system. Its authorities are meant to be outside the state. So even when you capture the state, those who decide upon the law are not themselves members of the state. The state is meant to protect the law, but the ulama and the authorities who have charge of the law are not themselves officials of the state. And the law stands as a bulwark against the despotic claims of the state, which may be dictatorial, or they indeed may be democratic, because Maududi is anxious about the potential of democracy to actually get rid of the law itself. All right? So you cannot have sovereignty vested even in the people, because the law must be sovereign. The law is already given, and the law already has its interpreters in the class of religious scholars. So the law's very archaism, he argues, the fact that it is old-fashioned, that it's hundreds of years old, as it were, allows it to stand against the politics of sovereignty, which is all about present-day considerations, right? How to get rid of someone, how to do, whereas the law, because it is somehow ancient, it cannot be brought to be defined entirely by presentist considerations. And as I said, is to be guided by specialists outside the state in society, precisely. So the point of Islamism is to have social self-governance through the law, and the law becomes a kind of second nature. Now, let me say something about how this way of thinking comes to define a country like Pakistan, right? So Pakistan, as you know, is the first Islamic republic created. Iran, I think, is probably the second. And in its constitutional history, it's had 3 constitutions, which have not had, as it were, much time to flourish. But in the preambles of all these constitutions, you have, thanks to Maududi and Maududi's agitations outside the Constituent Assembly, a kind of proviso where sovereignty belongs not to the people, but to God. Not even to the state, but to God. Now, you might think this is a purely symbolic factor, because after all, Pakistan otherwise runs like a modern state of dictatorial or military or democratic vintage. But what in fact happens when you displace sovereignty and say it belongs to God is it curiously creates an opportunity for the spectral, ghostly return of the sovereignty that has so been denied, because it's difficult to maintain modern politics in a modern state without any idea of sovereignty. of where ultimate authority vests. And I would like to suggest that the administrative followed by the military coup is the sign of the return of the sovereign in Pakistan's history, which of course has had many coups. So quite apart from the other reasons why Pakistan might have had military coups, one of them I think is this, that the exceptional authority that is claimed by the army when taking over the state is precisely where sovereignty manifests itself. And it can do so because it has no place in the constitutional structure of the country itself. It has been displaced to God. Right? So now, because Islamism presumes this kind of self-governing society, even though it wants to, as it were, conquer the state, it wants to conquer the state and yet disallow it from altering what it considers the fundamental character of Sharia, right, whose authority lies outside the state. Precisely because of this, it cannot really tolerate political conflict and the sovereign claims that underlie political conflicts, the claims to sovereignty. And so what Islamism's politics, if you will, relies upon is a logic of complementarity and segregation, right? So men and women are complementary, but they need to be segregated. Muslims and non-Muslims are sort of complementary, but they need to be segregated in various ways. Different classes. And so, and I note this precisely to show how similar it is to the way in which caste is understood as an organic system, which also depends upon a logic of complementarity and segregation, right? So no one is going to say any longer that this is hierarchical. What they say is, oh no, everyone is equal, but there is a complementarity and they should not be competition, right? And in effect, therefore, that there should be segregation. Now, I'm coming to my end. I see that I've just hit an hour here. So I've given you, I hope, some indication of the problem that modern politics poses for Islamism, all right? Because Islamism has to get rid of the whole historical language of politics that had characterized pre-colonial Muslim societies. It has also to repudiate the key category of sovereignty which characterizes modern Western politics and modern politics in general. And it depends upon this old if you will, anarchistic vision of a society that runs itself, in its case, through Sharia or through law, right? Now, through the 20th century, through much of the 20th century, Islamism couldn't really get rid of the state altogether. It had to conquer it just as the Soviets conquered the state, but attempt to roll it back. And it's the conquest and the rolling back that take up so much of what we call the politics of Islamism. And in a way, it was unthinkable to get rid of the state altogether, because of course the Islamists were part of initially a colonial and then nationalist context, and in global terms, eventually a Cold War context in which the state was the site of ideology. So you needed it to propagate your ideology. You needed its coercive instruments, even if you wanted to roll them back eventually, right? It's a similar ambiguity that characterizes communism itself, right? Or the Soviet state itself, which, remember, there's a state and its representative institutions, and then there's the party, the Communist Party, which is actually the superior authority. So you have the state, but you have authority outside the state, oddly. And that's the way the Islamist state is meant to work as well. You have the state, though you don't like it much, and you need its instruments, but you also have the party, which is where real authority lies, and whose task is eventually to get rid of the state. So this is the Cold War scenario in which both Pakistan and Iran emerge as Islamic republics. Pakistan never becomes an Islamist state. It has a quite mixed system. Iran does, of course. but it's a Shia state, and it's run by, if you will, a kind of very strong ulama class of traditionally trained jurists. The Sunni world doesn't really have that kind of class, at least not in of the kind of the really institutionalized kind that the Shias do. And in Sunni Islam, it is non-clerics, non-jurists who become, like Maududi, Islamists. And often it's people with secular educations, engineers, doctors, lawyers, etc. So these are the Islamist authorities. They don't really have classical or traditional training. So here are these people. They're quite modern people. Maududi was a journalist, a very modern profession. And they have taken from anarchism and from communism and from sort of Western political thought more generally. They have delegitimized pre-colonial Muslim political thought, and they have put together some kind of ideological state of the Cold War vintage, whose inner dynamic is based on this bifurcation between in Soviet terms, the state and the party. That remains in place until the end of the Cold War. And with the end of the Cold War, you have a collapse of the very figure of the ideological state, which had been, let us recall, the norm, the standard of all third world, or most third world states or post-colonial states. They had in large part been ideological states. Often they had been one-party states, right? And so Islamism works in that context. Once the context is gone, thanks to the end of the Cold War, there's an extraordinary shift. And there are two directions in which Islamism goes. Well, there's the two directions. One we have already seen, this sort of Cold War style ideological state form. The other is a new neoliberal form, where you have the effort to think about Muslim societies not by taking over the state, but through the market, right? So there's kind of marketized form of Islam where, through the commodification of Muslim practices and comportment. So the mass production of headscarves and of Muslim gear of various kinds, televisions, radio stations, fashion, burkinis, you name it, it's there, right? And this is done not through the state and not through any particular party. It's done through the market by entrepreneurs, etc. And in countries like Turkey and Malaysia, you see this at a fairly high level. The neoliberalization of Islam in its post-Cold War incarnation. So you have these two forms. Apart from them, you have a kind of the emergence of an entirely new set of discussions and political forms that are no longer Islamists. So I want to end by suggesting that Islamism is in effect a dead project. Of course, it's still with us and its ideas are still with us, but I doubt if they have any future to them. It was a form that emerged in the early 20th century. It took on this very Cold War ideological character, and that in the post-Cold War period seems to have narrowed down and come to its end. And I want to mention two of the new forms in which, if you will, a Muslim politics takes, which are not Islamist. So one has to do with the emergence of new global networks at the end of the Cold War, of which the mass mobilizations in support of, or rather in protest against, alleged insults delivered Muhammad, the Muslim prophet, are the most obvious ones. And not accidentally, the first of these, the Rushdie affair, happens in 1989, at the same time that the Cold War comes to an end, right? The same year. And you have the making of a new global arena thanks to the end of the Cold War. the collapse of the ideological state as a form, and the emergence of new global networks. And one of them is these through media, right, through new media, these mobilizations of Muslims globally for the first time in a really significant way, in protesting against insults to Muhammad. I won't go into why Muhammad and say why not God, and that's for another discussion. And Rushdie, of course, is the great example of them. So that's one form. And that includes all kinds of people. These are not necessarily Islamists. They could be Islamists, they could be non-Islamists, they could be all kinds of people. They're not ideologically defined or marked, right? The second equally global form is, of course, global militancy, which emerges in a big way with 9/11, but it has precedence in the decade or two before 9/11. And Al-Qaeda, of course, is the great exemplar of this, where you have a movement that doesn't even want a state. All right, Al-Qaeda doesn't have any idea. It really is a global network movement. It's about the expansion of violence globally. It's about taking the human race itself as it's both its subject and its object. And it doesn't mention the state, and it isn't really ideological in the way that Islamism was. Right. So I will end by leaving you with these two new emergent forms, and suggest that, if you will, in both these options that I've described, both the neoliberal version of Islamism in the Islam of the market and these global networks, Amir Ali's invocation of a partnership between Christianity and Islam returns as a global form. And it returns because and this goes back to what I was saying at the very beginning of my talk, that like Islamism, these new forms of Islam cannot rely upon, they invoke scripture endlessly, of course, but they really cannot rely upon any pre-colonial forms of, or very few pre-colonial forms of political language, or indeed even on occasion theological language. So when you look at the Rushdie affair and all these prior and subsequent examples of protests against insults allegedly delivered to Muhammad, what you see is the invocation not of Islamic theological categories or Muslim categories, but of Christian categories to describe them. So blasphemy, we usually, of course, use that term, blasphemy, which is a Christian term. It's not a Muslim term. They are Islamic terms, but they are rarely, if ever, used. Very interesting. The terms used are all, if you will, secular or everyday or quotidian or profane. Like gustakhi and rasalat, right? The impudence or insult. This is not a theological category. So I wanted to end there precisely by showing how, just as in the beginning, in the second half of the 19th century, these new Muslim forms and new forms of Islamic movement and politics are actually stymied by the fact that in repudiating the pre-colonial language of Muslim politics, they remain stuck within a European, if you will, epistemological closure, from which they can break out occasionally. But here, the invocation of a Christian term like blasphemy and Christian models like the blasphemy law of Britain for the Rushdie affair and the Irish blasphemy law, which the Pakistani state under Nawaz Sharif used to refer to, their references tend to be largely Christian, very, very interestingly. So you come back to this partnership of Christianity and Islam that Amir Ali mentioned, as I said in the beginning of my talk. And what you have, I think, is a Muslim politics of today which rather than be marked by its theological character, is marked by the loss of theology. And that, if you will, is its great problem. Thank you.